Okay, we are live again for another of the Dr. Sadler AMA sessions. I'm just going to adjust the lighting a little bit here. And we've got questions already lined up, so I'm going to jump into those without any further adu. Let me post my usual thing about Patreon. Those who support me on Patreon, thanks for doing so. That's what makes this sort of thing possible for me. So let's look at how many questions? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We already have 6 questions lined up. So let's get started with those. Harry Doble, do I know much about the postmodernism of Umberto Eco? He says, I was wondering if you could talk about that for a bit. So, postmodernism is one of those terms that we got to be a bit careful with. There's not one postmodernism out there. There's a variety of them. And actually, one of the better books discussing that is, although it's pretty dense, is Jameson's Postmodernism. So Eco himself was critical of some of the other people that get lumped under postmodernism, like, say, Derrida, for example. And you can see that in his Postmodernism and the Philosophy of Language. But, the real meat of Eco's stuff is really in, like, his theory of semiotics and these other works primarily focused on developing a comprehensive semiotics. And you could ask a question, okay, so is semiotics postmodern? And it really depends on, well, whose semiotics are you talking about, and what do you have in mind by postmodern? Eco is perfectly willing to recognize some things that I suppose you could say are postmodern themes, very broadly. Like, a lot of people say that, well, if you're thinking that language and signs play a central role in constituting the reality that we're in, and that you can never get away from those. And so there's no absolute meaningful world out there that you can connect with independently of language, then you're a postmodernist. If that's the case, then a lot of people are postmodernists, right? And many of them are actually there, in early modernity. So you could call Eco, I guess, a moderate postmodernist, if you wanted to say that. He doesn't think that everything is up for grabs, or that some of the themes that we see identified with it now today are necessarily holding. And he does seem to think that there is, things that are better and worse, objectively speaking. He just thinks things are much more complicated than many of the modernists would say they are. And I think he's completely right in that respect. As a matter of fact, Eco is one of the people who I do actually recommend when people start asking me about, hey, I want to do philosophy of language, or I'm interested in signs or stuff like that, because he's a very accessible thinker. All right, Bogdan, have you read Althusser, and if so, what's your opinion on him? Overrated. I have read him back in graduate school. I thought it was overly complicated, and much of it seemed to be the sort of stuff that would date very quickly. I think that many of the people who talk, just like with a lot of thinkers, I think a lot of the people who talk about, drawing on Althusser don't actually understand what they're reading. So I'd say that too with, like, Hegel, or many other thinkers as well. People are always advocating for certain things, and you're like, well, okay, so what did you get out of this book? And they give you the humana, kind of hemming and hawing sort of thing. I think that the stuff that's good in Althusser you could probably get from summaries. I just don't. He's not somebody who I see in the maybe 30, 40 years remaining to me and reinvesting time to study. Here's an interesting one from Carl Bod. Why do you think Plato insists on giving us third, fourth, and even fifth-hand accounts? Some sort of libel law protection, a more epistemological reason? Also, are you going to George Webb's to get free burgers? So I'm not going to George Webb's because it's going to be mobbed, right? To get free burgers, although I do like George Webb's. That's a Milwaukee thing. So because our local baseball team is doing extraordinarily well, George Webb's has this offer. You could call it almost like Milwaukee patriotism, right? They will give people free burgers for celebrating the Brewers doing well, and I think those sort of things are great. I just don't like crowds, and I hate waiting in line. So no, I won't be there. Now, why does Plato give us these third, fourth, fifth hand accounts? Fifth hand account, I think do we actually have a genuinely fifth hand account? Maybe in the Symposium, right? Because we have a story that's being told that was previously related of the speeches that were given. Socrates himself is recounting in the heart of the dialogue what Diotima said to him. So that might be fourth hand, that might be fifth hand. But we do have quite a few accounts where, think about the Theaetetus or other dialogues where there's some framing going on. Why does Plato do that? Does he insist on it? He doesn't insist on it. He's just giving you these accounts, and you can read them or not read them. They're what we have. And is it to protect him from libel? No, not at all. That sort of thing wasn't an issue back then in that way. It could be that there's a couple different theories out there about this. It could be that he's distancing himself in some way from the doctrines that are being put forth. It could be that he's inviting us into a narrative framework, which is an interesting literary device, and I think quite successful. There might be other reasons for it. Nobody really knows why he did that. Maybe he's trying to give us some sort of demonstration about his own abilities. That's what somebody like Nietzsche would probably say. Or it could be that he's just suggesting to us that any narrative is by its very nature somewhat unreliable and requires us to think. All right, I and thou. How often do you reread philosophical text? Do you reread the entire text or just certain sections? Depends on the text. I mean, people ask me those sorts of questions all the time. Like, I've been getting quite a few recently on the Dr. Sadler bookshelf tour, where people are like, how much time do you spend on each book? And I'm like, how the hell would I know? I don't keep track of that to begin with. And, some books require more time, some books require less time. It really depends on the work. And how often do I reread philosophical texts? It depends on how much time I have on my hands and whether I'm teaching them and, whether I'm trying to do some work on them or I'm reading them for my own edification. And do I reread the entire text or just certain sections? Again, totally depends on the context. Some texts I try to make a practice of rereading once a year, like going through Descartes' Meditations in the French and Latin and the Objections and Replies, or Plato's Dialogues. But for the most part, it's totally dependent on the situation. Now, here's an interesting one from TK. If you could mash together the brains of two philosophers, which ones would you combine for the best results and which ones for the worst results? Worst results. I don't know. Just pick any of the people who are kind of third rate and probably disagree with each other. So there'd be a bit of, split personality there, and mash them together. This is actually kind of an interesting thought, because what happens in great philosophers who actually work in a dialectical manner and take up other philosophers' ideas, and I don't mean the bastardized thing that people call Hegelian dialectic with the thesis, antithesis, synthesis bullshit, which is not real Hegel anyway. I mean dialectical in Aristotle and Cicero's sense, the ancient sense, where you're actually engaging with previous thought on a topic, canvassing it, trying to incorporate what's best in it. And this is what you see thinkers like Aristotle doing quite frequently, and you see that continuing on through history, with people who are brilliant thinkers on their own. Even the ones who pretend to be like totally breaking from everybody else, like Descartes or Hobbes, aren't doing that. So in a way, when we're doing good philosophy, we're already mashing the brains of 2 or 3 or multiple philosophers together and then culling things out from them. All right. Bertrand asks, are you familiar with Michel René Barnes and his work? No. Also, have you read much of St. Gregory of Nyssa's work? Yeah, but a long time ago. It's been quite some time since I've gone back to him. There was some project where I was using some of his ideas for something. It was having to do with some history of an issue, but I don't even remember what it was. So, all right, let me skip down here. The greeter. What do I make of Thales' first principle? Did he choose water because everything needs water? Did he think everything is made up of water? Well, he had a couple different reasons why he thought water made sense. I suppose one thing would be, seeing that it takes different forms, right? So that naturally suggests it as something that could be other things. And then some of it had to do with like notions about, fossils of fish in different places. So he's thinking there more water than there was before. And what do I make of the first principle? I mean, obviously everything isn't made of water. Nietzsche talks about this in his discussion of ancient Greek thought. I forget exactly the title, but it was stuff that was culled from his classes. And he says, well, this is important not because he picked water, but because he picked something as the explanatory principle for everything. That made it philosophical in a way that previous accounts, like, mythological accounts, did not. So that's, there's something to that. I don't think you'd want to stick with Thales. Thales apparently was a pretty brilliant guy. We tell this in philosophy classes to prove that philosophers are not entirely impractical. He managed to corner the olive market, the olive press market, because he was interested in meteorological phenomena, and he figured out that there was going to be a great crop of olives, so he went around and rented out all the presses, and then he charged people a good bit of money to use them and made a fortune. All right, Vadram Andy Aluri, could I explain the basic thesis of critical theory? Well, critical theory doesn't just mean one thing. So again, we have an ambiguity problem, just like with postmodernism. So if we're being very strict about it in terms of philosophy, we should associate critical theory with the Frankfurt School. Horkheimer, Adorno, Marcuse, later on Habermas, Oppel, people like that. Erich Fromm would fit in there as well. If we're using critical theory in a broader sense, like they do in literature classes, it can mean anything you like, just about. And so that's why I don't usually use that term very much, unless I'm talking with philosophers. So the Frankfurt School, they were Marxists, and they were very interested in and troubled by the fact that a lot of the predictions about class solidarity and class consciousness that should have, in the classic view, led to World War I being stopped rather early by a number of proletarian revolts and strikes and cutoffs like that, were in effect co-opted by nationalism. And so they applied themselves to trying to figure out, all right, well, what the hell went wrong? Why didn't things go as predicted? And in order to do that, they wanted to harness the resources that non-Marxist philosophy could bring to bear. And you might say social theory and psychology. So they drew upon all other sources, like, for example, Nietzsche or Freud. In the case of Habermas, all sorts of other things later on. But the idea, you could say, what is it about? Why is it called critical theory? Because it's engaged in critique of culture and ideology, and trying to steer humanity towards some sort of better position, some sort of better society. being aware as well of the fact that simply theorizing the world in a new way is not automatically going to change it, and being quite suspicious of many of the things that are put forward as progressive as being genuinely so. So that's a characterization that can work for that. There's another one from Speedix. What do I think about Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, his work and his personality? Do you know what he's doing, etc.? Personal things. I like Leibniz quite a lot. I actually, my early work, I was doing a lot of stuff on Leibniz. I haven't done anything for a while, and I haven't taught him for a while, actually. But his Discourse on Metaphysics used to be something I was reading and rereading over and over again, in part because I really enjoyed it. It's a very short work, but there's a lot of cool stuff sort of encapsulated there. Leibniz, gets called the universal genius of Europe, and he really was. I mean, he made contributions across the board, from history, which was actually his day job. He was supposed to be the historian for the House of Hanover, and never quite finished some of the projects, to mechanics, to diplomacy, to straight up metaphysics and philosophy and ethics, to theological discussions. Leibniz was involved in all of those sorts of things. So I think he's somebody who's definitely worth reading. Giovanni Lavanya, wouldn't Derrida more accurately be classified as post-structuralist? I guess so. I mean, post-structuralist doesn't really mean that much either. It's, you can't be a post-structuralist without also being a structuralist. I mean, read Speech and Phenomena for one thing, and it's the same thing with postmodernist. If you're a postmodernist, you're also a modernist in many ways. That's part of what the original postmodernists like Lyotard, discussed. You can't just sort of have these nice, neat breaks and classifications. I'm much less interested in how do we classify people, and I'm much more interested in let's get into their thought and see what ideas are there and which of them are bullshit. That just happened to be popular at the time and people liked because they sounded sexy, and which of them make a real contribution to understanding things, and then where are their connections between them. Daniel Cox, to what extent do you think any of the attempts to recover metaphysics, like John Milbank or Adrian Pabst, after the critical projects of the 20th century, example Heidegger, Derrida, are successful? Well, I mean, you're talking there about two radical orthodoxy types, and I think that's an interesting project, but it's not particularly appealing across the board to many people. I think that metaphysics doesn't need to be recovered. I think that in academic philosophy, there's an awful lot of faddishness and an awful lot of very bracketed thinking. So I'm going to give you an example of something that's similar to metaphysics in terms of a revival. Virtue ethics, right? Oh, we have a 20th century revival of virtue ethics, starting with these people like Geach and Anscombe and all that. That's bullshit, complete bullshit. Virtue ethics never went away. If you read across the history of philosophy, there's just as much virtue ethics being discussed in the early 20th century. You just got to look for it in places other than Cambridge or Oxford, right? It's not like it ever went away. And so you have this sort of, I'll use another analogy here. It's sort of like living in a place that at one time was fashionable and then went out of fashion, and then all the yuppies and the hipsters come in and they're like, oh, look at this is all brand new, and you're like, where the hell have you people been? We've been doing this, living like this for years and years and years. So the same thing with metaphysics. I mean, just because Heidegger said, we're at the end of metaphysics, or, we'll take Derrida and the deconstruction of metaphysics, or Jean-Luc Marion, crossing out being and all that, just because those people say that that's what's going on, and just because they have a big echo machine in lots of people in the Anglosphere, who think those are sexy themes, jumping on that doesn't mean that that's really the case. I mean, people continue to do metaphysics, and there's always a metaphysics behind whatever, anti-metaphysics you put out. This is one thing where Heidegger was completely right about Nietzsche, right? Nietzsche is a metaphysician. He's also an anti-metaphysician. And I don't understand why people are always so like thrown for a loop by this sort of thing, So, Milbank and Pabst, I would say the same thing with Graham Ward or Catherine Pickstock, perhaps less so with Philip Blond, very sophisticated thinkers. And they're trying to, draw on pre-modern thought in order to, recover some sort of metaphysical perspective. And that's fine. But guess what? Plenty of other people were doing that a long time before them, including some of the people like, Milbank idolizes Blondel. Well, Blondel actually did it better and more thoroughly, and it's not just the early Blondel, but throughout his career. And so did Antonin Sertillange, and so did Yves Simon, and we can go on and on and on with this. Max Scheler was doing that too, in the phenomenological approach. And there were plenty of, followers in the sense that they're succeeding after Heidegger, who didn't think that metaphysics is completely to be thrown away, like Gadamer or Arendt, or Paul Ricoeur, right? And we can go on and on and on with this sort of thing. So the question that you have to ask is it worth the time to actually delve into these people, or should we just, go back to some of the classic thinkers and reappropriate them? I mean, if I was given the choice between Milbank or Arendt, I'm going to read Arendt. I certainly find her stuff more interesting. Awful philosophy. You should ask this question right at the start. Are there any terms that are thrown about that just make you groan? Like, for me, it's usually labeling everything bad as postmodern. Yeah, so, I mean, most people who use the term postmodern should probably not use the term because they don't have any idea what the hell it means. Same thing for, here's another term that I think, is really worn out. When I hear somebody accuse another person of virtue signaling, I just stop paying attention, because there's nothing more virtue signaling than accusing another person of virtue signaling. And people do that on the left and the right. It's not just a rightist term. People were using that term in academics on the left before it became a big thing on the right. But to me, it just makes people sound so stupid when they say stuff like that, and they might not be stupid people, but they're choosing something that, at least for me, is a huge turnoff. Postmodernism by itself is just bad. No, or accusing modernism of being automatically bad. No, that's equally foolish. Hegelian dialectic. Whenever I have somebody who tries to sell me as if I haven't been reading Hegel for decades, that Hegel was really about thesis, antithesis, synthesis. I don't roll my eyes, but I'm mentally doing that. So there's quite a few things like that. I mean, I might come up with some other ones. Some of it is kind of time dependent. Like, for a while, everybody was reading Levinas, and then we'd all have to talk about the face of the other. And I like Levinas, but after a while, you get kind of sick of hearing how we're effacing the face of the other, right? And there's stuff like that over and over again. There's these buzzwords in philosophy that get thrown around. Another one from analytic philosophy: defeaters. This is a defeater. Again, I hear that, and right or wrong, my mind just kind of like closes up, and I'm like, this person isn't worth listening to because of the jargon, All right, Jay Tunick, favorite church father: Augustine doesn't count. I mean, I don't know that Augustine would be my favorite anyway. I like him, and he's very interesting, and we certainly have a lot of texts by him that are worth reading. Including some of the minor texts. Like, I like his stuff on lying. He's got a couple pieces on that specifically. But I don't know, if I had to pick my absolute favorite among the people that are called the fathers, I guess if you were going to go by like my reading history, it'd probably be John Cassian. or Clement of Alexandria. Both of them I'm a real fan of. Clement I really like for two things in particular. One is his notion that the way in which human beings are made in the image of God is in that we are musical. And then the other is his willingness to view ancient Greek philosophy as sort of the Greek equivalent of the Jewish scriptures that the Christians call the Old Testament working for them. I like that sort of approach to things. All right. Daniel Cox, do you think there's a meaningful connection between Nietzsche's search for an overman and Nietzsche's hints of a possible return to Christ after we reject Paul's corruption of Christianity? Well, I think the Paul, Christianity thing's been kind of done to death. I don't think things are quite so simple as, well, you had the Gospels and then you had Paul, and Paul corrupted everything, the way they like to talk about in the 19th century, people like Renan and all that, who Nietzsche had read, I don't think there's enough material there to really get anything out of Nietzsche himself with a return to Christ. Do you know what Nietzsche talks most positively about is actually the church as a political institution. He's kind of admiring of their ability to harness and use power, right? So I don't think there's you can get that much out of Nietzsche himself, but you can take people like, say, Max Scheler, and who's a Christian thinker, and some of the other Christian appropriations of Nietzsche, and maybe get something out of it. I don't know that like the death of God theology stuff is particularly meaningful anymore. That stuff has not aged particularly well. That's the stuff from the 60s and the 70s of like Thomas Olitzer, so yeah. All right. Let's see. So here's a question that I get asked quite a bit by Saipa de Schepper. What's my opinions on Schopenhauer? I noticed you do not have videos dedicated to him. So you should never draw any conclusions from what I've got videos dedicated to about how I think about somebody. I don't have any videos dedicated to Leibniz. And I just mentioned earlier that I really like Leibniz. What I actually am able to shoot videos on is a function of time and energy and, quite frankly, finances. The more financial freedom that I enjoy through Patreon support, the more videos I'll be able to shoot. And, I do commissioned videos as well. People are, well, can you do a video on this? So I shoot them the video that I shot where I'm like, hey, you want a video on X? Commission me to do it. Because this is the world we live in. There's only so much of these resources. So I like Schopenhauer. I've said this many times. I think he's somebody who is not, just to read because you can't understand Nietzsche without him. I think that's bullshit. But Schopenhauer is worth reading in his own right. He's an interesting guy. He's got a lot of great stuff to say. You don't necessarily have to agree with his entire world perspective to really appreciate what it is that he is doing. And I was fortunate enough that I never got to take a Schopenhauer class as a graduate student, but a couple of years back when I was a visiting scholar at European Graduate School, I was able to take a Schopenhauer class with Wolfgang Schirmacher, the at that time president of the International Schopenhauer Society. And he talked about the white Schopenhauer as opposed to the gray Schopenhauer, and had a very interesting interpretation of how we might get a more optimistic Schopenhauer. And this is a guy who's been reading and teaching Schopenhauer for nearly all of his career. So, there's something to be taken seriously there, I think, about that. So yeah, Schopenhauer's great. I don't know when I'll shoot videos on him. Right now, this semester I'm shooting videos primarily on the texts and thinkers that I'm teaching in class. And so, but if there's enough demand, I'll do it. But it takes some time and effort. All right, here's another from Daniel Cox. You stress the importance of primary sources. You don't seem to spend much time with secondary sources. Does this make it difficult to publish? No, not really. I mean, I work, like I've said, when I'm, doing academic writing, I read secondary sources because that's sort of the expectation. And sometimes there's interesting things that people have to say in those. I mean, all you have to do is, you can go to academia.edu and look at some of the stuff I've published, and you'll see that I do engage with secondary sources. But when I'm, trying to think about doing videos on Plato, I'm not going to bother reading other people's stuff. I'm going to read the Plato, or, if I'm doing blog entries, unless there's something really compelling about somebody's interpretation, in which case, usually I'm reading them as a primary source who is discussing Plato. Like if again, let's take Arendt. Arendt has a lot of great stuff to say about proiresis in the Life of the Mind, or maybe it's it's the Life of the Mind, not the Human Condition. Well, she's interesting. She's not just commenting on Epictetus and Aristotle. She's developing her own thing. So she's in some respect a secondary source, but she's a primary source. And then, when it comes to other things, like if I'm writing on proiresis, I'm going to see what other people have had to say about it in the last 50 years. But I don't use secondary sources as my avenue into a thinker, All right, Mike Ray, how would you describe your general political views, if you're comfortable saying that is? Well, I don't fit into the political spectrum very well. And, whether it's the right-left spectrum, or even if you want to add authoritarian and libertarian, I don't fit in very well, in part because I'm a virtue ethicist. And this is an issue that goes all the way back to classic virtue ethicists like Aristotle and Cicero. You're not going to find a comfortable place, because political parties, by their very nature as coalition parties, tend to attract people who use the language of virtue but are corrupt and out for their own constituency and don't really care much about the common good. And there are many people within political parties who do espouse that, but they don't rise to the top. It's pretty rare, So you pick quite often the least of evils. And for me, that frequently changes from election to election. I can tell you that this time around, because the Republicans have been so asinine on so many topics, including the whole gun control thing and the NRA, I'm going to do my little bit of punishing them at the polls by voting for their opposition, which is the Democrats. But that's not really an endorsement of the Democratic Party, which has all sorts of failures and problems of its own. And if the Republicans get their act together and start acting like decent human beings on a whole bunch of different topics, then I might start listening to them again. Other times I vote third party. I usually do vote. There have been a few cases where, due to poor planning, I haven't. But yeah, and I tend to think that if you are, this is something that I'm in complete agreement with Alistair McIntyre on. If you are going to be involved politically, it probably has to be at a local level where people haven't become quite so corrupted by the rising process. But even then, you have to evaluate almost everything on a case-by-case basis. So that's part of my political views. I'll say on a few topics, I think that our system that we have is very dysfunctional. I don't see any easy ways to fix it, because unfortunately the people who would fix it are benefiting from the dysfunction, and that would be the two main parties and all of their lobbyists and associated industries, and the masses of people who love, thinking in a very blinded way and consume the media sources associated with them on both left and right. But right now, much more on the right. So, for a long time, I'd say I was more opposed to the left. Now I'm probably more opposed to the right. There are some things where, as an American, I think that we are engaged in things that at this point we should have gotten past. We should have universal health care. That's not socialism, which is a dirty word for Americans. Pretty much all the first world countries do. There's no reason why we shouldn't have it. We blow a lot of money on military budgets and on policing and surveillance and things like that. And I think a lot of that money could be much better spent in social welfare programs, which I am for. I think that we should consider, how the lower classes are affected by policies in our policy making. And I'm not for like increasing dependency or anything like that, but I think that that's much more of a consideration than how some millionaires are doing. And I think that we're also stuck, and here's a bigger picture political thing. I think that neither of our political parties is doing anything to rethink what we're going to do in an economy where we're probably going to have 30 to 40% unemployment or underemployment as robotics, logistics, AI becomes even more prevalent. And I think we ought to be doing a lot of thinking about that, because this idea of, well, we're just going to create jobs is asinine. It's not based in any sort of reality, and we need to be thinking about how we're going to keep society from breaking down due to this. And is it going to be some sort of top-down system, whether cutthroat capitalism or totalitarianism, where the people who own the new means of production are going to super benefit and the rest of us are going to be scrabbling or screwed? That's not what I want to see. And if a party actually does decide that they want to do something about that, I would love to see them engaging with that. But right now, neither party is. I also think that the climate change is real, and we ought to be doing something about it. And we ought to quit this stupid back and forth bickering about it that doesn't serve anyone. Definitely not the present environment or the generations yet to come. I think it's extremely short-sighted of nearly everybody in our Republican Party and many of the people in our Democrat Party not to be taking this seriously and to be deluding themselves that it's somehow just cyclical or something like that. So these are some of my political views. I have many more I suppose I could share, but those are the ones that are kind of top of mind. But you can see that not going to make me very popular with either side. All right, let's see what we got here. Here's one from Horace Akbar. Was Thomas More's Utopia satirical work? What are the arguments for or against this interpretation? It's been a while since I've looked at it, but satirical, yes, it is satirical in some respects, right? Is it designed to be? So you can ask about like parts, and then you can ask about the totality of it. Is the entirety of it designed to be a satirical work? I don't think so. But parts of it are targeting things either existing in his own time or at other times. Yeah. So that it depends on what you mean by satirical. So are we talking about satirical in having elements of satire, or is the whole thing just supposed to be a farce the way that some of, say, Swift's pieces are, right? So good question there. Let me get back to stuff here. Giovanna, thoughts on origin? Not somebody I've thought about for quite a while. So I haven't really thought much about origin for a while. Gumnam, your views on David Bentley Hart? Again, somebody I don't read much of. I'll say that I appreciate that as an Anselm scholar, that he has a good piece saying the orthodox interpretations of Anselm are pretty off base, because they are. It's one of those weird points of contention, stupid contention, where there's like a given story, and then it keeps people from actually like reading the text well. All right, Jay Tunick, what are your thoughts on universals? Do you buy into the forms theory? How do we make sense of particulars and universals, in my personal eclectic opinion? I don't have any problem believing that there are universals. Do I believe in Plato's forms? No, because it's a very difficult theory when you actually like use the Platonic text to make a hell of a lot of sense out of it. What's the form of courage, for example? But I guess you could say that in some respects, I'm somewhat Platonist, right? I'm willing to believe that some things are existing besides just particulars. It's not something I actually worry very much about, quite frankly, though. Robots, thoughts on Jacques Maritain and Dietrich von Hildebrand? I'm a fan of both. I think that Maritain was sometimes over hasty in the positions that he took and a little bit too rigid. Like, for example, in my work on the Christian philosophy debates, I've shown that Blondel's position and the Maritain-Gilson position are actually complementary to each other, and that they shouldn't have been at loggerheads. But that Maritain and Blondel had bad blood going way, way back, because Maritain was, again, over hasty, a member of Action Française, the proto-fascist, hard-right Catholic organization run by an atheist, Charles Maurras, who Maritain stayed with until they were condemned by the Vatican. But I think there's some good stuff in Maritain. Von Hildebrand, I like quite a bit. For those who don't know who he is, he was a student of Max Scheler. He's got some really great works, and does some really nice phenomenological analyses of affectivity and of what the human person is like. Von Hildebrand, of course, influenced other later phenomenologists like John Paul II, Karol Wojtyła, right? Who is quite interesting as well. So Tyresu has a question here that's not going to be easy to answer. What does Hegel mean by concrete universal? So the concrete universal, I mean, this is going to be a very thumbnail sketch, is where within the historical development, so within some sort of context, you have something that really has the force of a universal, but it also exists as such. And this is, part of the Hegelian dialectic in terms of ideas, the real dialectic, not the thesis, antithesis, synthesis nonsense. Actually, it's not nonsense. I mean, it does have some limited scope, particularly in Hegel's lectures. But one of the things that you see within Hegel's, treatments of things is ideas have to be made real. They cannot simply exist as ideas if they're going to have some sort of efficacy. They have to be made wirklich. They have to be made actual. He often gets a lot of grief for saying the rational is real, the real is rational. It's really the real should be rational. The rational should be real. How do we do this? How did it happen in the historical phases before that? And so the concrete universal plays an important role in that. And you could also think of it as involving a certain kind of subjectivity and agency, figuring out what it is over time. Lukash, any opinion on Valerie? Oh, I just scrolled down here. Valerie, somebody's. Oh boy, there's a lot of questions here. Hardcastle's argument that there's no such thing as psychogenic pain. Nope, because I haven't read it. And I don't even know who Valerie Hardcastle is, and I'm not quite sure what's meant by psychogenic pain. So no opinion on that. Tony Höfling, is it in this age of tribalism and division, is there a philosopher who would be informative for us? Lots. Yeah. Again, Hannah Arendt, right? Great person to read. Again, one of those books I was mentioning earlier where people are buying it, but I don't believe that most people are actually reading it because it's so dense. Arendt's, Origins of Totalitarianism book. I think 90% of the people who talk about it have only read smidgens of it. But great thinker. Who else? I mean, if you can read him, read Habermas. He's pretty dense too. Alistair McIntyre. Important thinker as well, and we could go on and on and on. There's plenty of people doing great work, ostensibly in ancient or medieval philosophy, but thinking things through, like Julia Annas. Chris Gill just has a great book out recently on the structured self and Hellenistic thought. But that's things that could make us think about the present. So there are hundreds of philosophers who we could be looking at for understanding our current condition. Giorgio Agamben, another good person in the present. All right, Spedix, what is ontology? Depends on who you ask, right? Because different people have different meanings. Some it's just identical with metaphysics, study of what is, to ontos, right? To ontos. For others, it's a more restricted operation, and you can talk about it as like a field. You could talk about persons ontologies, right? Travis, is Descartes himself a hermeneut in interpreting a radical foundationalism separate from the philosophies of the medieval era and antiquity? That wouldn't make him a hermeneutic person, but he is engaged in interpretation, in that he still uses ideas from medieval and ancient philosophy to make sense of things and then reinterprets them. Sure. Which philosopher? Oh, there's a great one from Penchpinner. Which philosophers should an economist read? Well, you should read the people that the original, when political economy emerged from philosophy, you should read those people themselves, and read the people that are precursors to them that they're responding to. I mean, Aristotle has important economic discussions in, say, Politics Book 1, right? There's a pseudo-Aristotelian text, the Economics, which is worth reading too, and so you could read all those previous discussions of that, and read it not just to like see what they had to say, but to think about, do these contribute any useful models for us, how we think about value. People in the present who are incorporating or critical of economics, you probably should read them as well, right? Okay, here's a good one. Chip, if you could have one dead philosopher come back and comment on the work of a specific one of their predecessors, who would you pick? Man, that is a tough one. So what we want is somebody who really understands one of their predecessors well. And putting aside the language issue, because, like if, let's say Cicero showed up, I wouldn't be able to speak Latin with him, or Hegel showed up. My German is not good enough to be able to follow somebody explaining high-level concepts to me. Yeah, so no, I guess I'd pick somebody who I'd really want to talk to myself. And I guess, if I had to pick somebody who I'd most like to talk to, it would be St. Anselm. And who would I have him comment on? Maybe Augustine, maybe Boethius, maybe John Cassian. So yeah, probably not a choice that a lot of people would relate to. Philosopher Ed, you said your mother had books like How to Make Your Child Exceptional. It was How to Give Your Child an Exceptional Mind. Looking back on it, what about your childhood environment, their parenting encouraged your intellectualism? So, I mean, I was fortunate in that I had good, good gifts to begin with, right? I'm somebody who could do a lot of abstract reasoning quite early, and I was very curious, and I was already, like, as a kid, like arranging things into patterns and stuff like that, right? But my childhood, so I was fortunate in that my mother could stay home a good bit of the time. She actually did when I was young, and my dad was still in law school at UW-Madison. She did work at the Oscar Mayer factory part-time, which meant we ate a lot of Oscar Mayer bologna and hot dogs and things like that. But she was very devoted to the idea of helping me to develop my talents. And I don't know exactly what she did. I don't remember most of this, but I know that I was reading by the time that I was 3, And then, I started reading my way through the World Book and just consuming whatever was put in front of me. I do remember my dad actually at one point telling me to knock off, reading street signs because I was doing that almost obsessively as we were driving around, and it was distracting him. And my dad spent a lot of time, talking with me and doing things, even though he was a very busy man. He had a CPA and a law degree by the time that I was 3. He became a tax attorney, and we ended up moving around a little bit within Wisconsin before we finally settled in. He started teaching me mathematics when I was 4, and he had a calculator that he used as sort of like the thing to get me to start paying attention to that. And he'd let me check my work, right? I also had people within my family, my larger family, the Lemrees side of the family, who were cultivating me. My great uncle Hubert only had, I think a 6th grade education, but was one of the best read persons that I've ever met. He read continuously, very much in favor of culture, would buy us books and magazine subscriptions as presents, and wanted to know what you were reading and what you got out of it. And he practiced this himself. He wrote notebook after notebook of entries of what he thought about this book or this movie. And there were other people like that within the family as well, many of whom didn't have much formal education, but who applied themselves. And I know that when I was a kid, I went to a Montessori preschool when I was 4. That probably did some good, and then I went to, public kindergarten and elementary school. So that was good. And then on my father's side, and here I'm talking about, of course, my adopted parents. My grandmother was, she was intellectually oriented as well, and so I think all of that played an important role in how I developed. But much of it was like letting me do things, letting me go to the library and get books and read things and study on my own, and encouraging me to do so. Not, and I saw my parents reading, and that is probably a very important thing too. I saw people taking pleasure in engaging in thinking and conversation and reading. So I was very fortunate, because I would say many children who are adopted, that's not always the case, right? So good for them. All right, here's a question from Travis. Care to elaborate on Descartes' hyperbolic doubt, its prevailing influence, and how philosophy moved on from it? Well, it's hyperbolic or methodological doubt. It's provoked discussions for years and years and years about whether you can do it, whether it's a good thing to do, some of which are on track, some of which are not. All the way down to like Peirce saying you can't really doubt like that, and Husserl saying, yeah, you need to do something like that once in your life in his Cartesian meditations. What do I need to elaborate on? Well, it's very thoroughgoing doubt, but Descartes himself is using it as a tool. Every semester that you teach the meditations, you always get like one student who doesn't read past meditation 2, and like is worried that everything's a dream from now on. And that's not where Descartes ends up, right? And notice too that Descartes himself says that this sort of doubt is not for everybody. There's some people who would never make their way out of it, and other people who it just doesn't suit. How did philosophy move on from it? You don't have to be a Cartesian, right? There's other ways of doing things. I think a lot of the moving on from it didn't take Descartes' doubt that seriously. But, you can say that about many other things as well, I suppose, right? All right, let me see if I can get back now to the previous questions. Here's another one too from Condottiero. Which philosophers take up the topic of loneliness or solitude in their works? Well, Epictetus has a whole chapter on loneliness or solitude in the discourses. So that's a good one to check out. And of course, Seneca, in his letters on consolation to different people, talks about that as well. The sort of the subjective feeling of loneliness. I mean, you could check out Cicero's Tusculan Disputations, which is about the Stoic, it's about not just the Stoic theory of emotions, that's books 3 and 4, but also death and things like that. I suppose you could say that Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy kind of is touching on that in the early parts too. And then somebody who's not often considered a philosopher, but I would say is worth calling him one, is Rainer Maria Rilke, and he talks about Einsamkeit, which can be translated as solitude or loneliness, plays a major role in his thought. Pascal is kind of touching on it too, mostly in terms of like the transformation of physical perspectives on the universe. He says, the silence of these infinite spheres frightens me or terrifies me. M'effroie is the French, fills me with fear. So there's quite a few people, and in a way, Nietzsche is also another important thinker to consider when it comes to that, because he's very often writing about being on his own. Thus spoke Zarathustra is filled with reflections on that. So I think those would all be good starting points. All right. Tai Saru, explain rational is real, real is rational. I already did that. Bogdan Kanavizik, are there any Slavic philosophers you find interesting? Yeah, I've mentioned Lev Shestov many times. Berdyaev I enjoy as well. Who else particularly comes to mind? Nobody else really pops to the top of the line for me. Okay. Azek Forn, what are your thoughts on the interpretation of Deleuze's dialectic of the servant and the master? He said this dialectic is already written from a servant point of view, since the postulate is you will need recognition while the true master will not seek that. Well, I think Deleuze is doing what Deleuze often does, which is he's doing history of philosophy, but doing it from Deleuze's perspective, which is often quite interesting, but you don't go to for like the faithful interpretation of what the ideas are. Where is Deleuze getting this from? I'd say in part from Nietzsche. Right. Made of clay, probably a vague question. Do you feel like people who dismiss post-structuralism, modernism, or say it's dangerous or right to do so, as in everything that it teaches is completely wrong? No, I think that people who say that any philosophy is completely wrong don't know what they're talking about, and probably should either shut up or spend more time studying philosophy. So this is a little bit off topic. People feel like they have to have an opinion on all these different things, or somehow they're like not intellectually engaged. It's fine to like step back when it comes to postmodernism. Just because people around you are like condemning it doesn't mean you have to do that. I mean, they may be totally off base. The honest intellectual thing to do is to find out for yourself. Read the stuff, and then come to conclusions about it. And don't just like read it to automatically find the quick answer. Read the stuff, immerse yourself in it, and then see if it is still bad or bullshit after that, right? Same thing goes for any philosopher. People are like, oh, Nietzsche's terrible. Or take Ayn Rand, right? Ayn Rand is just all garbage, right? Well, read her. I mean, then you'll be able to figure out what parts are garbage and what parts are actually on track. I mean, she uses the notion of a hierarchy of values. Is it somehow like, just complete ideological nonsense in Rand, but somehow in Max Scheler, the notion of hierarchy of values is a good idea? Nobody's completely off base. So, you don't have to feel like people are corralling you in and you have to take a stand on this stuff. It's fine to like take a step back and say, I want to find out for myself. Maybe you're right about this stuff being terrible or bad or corrosive. Maybe you're wrong about that. Why place such faith, really just blind faith, in the interpretations of other people when it comes to these matters? All right. Brewmaster, what do you think is the basis of knowledge? Which out of foundationalism, coherentism, or infinitism do you find most plausible? Or if not any of these three, maybe a separate theory. Well, I don't do isms. So if you say foundationalism, I'm going to want to know whose foundationalism, which, foundation on what, right? I don't even know what infinitism means. And coherentism could mean a lot of different things. So I think that, we don't have a basis of knowledge. I'm not sure why we think we need a single basis of knowledge anyway, and we can't be more pluralistic about this and recognize that our knowledge comes to us through a number of different modes. All right, I and thou. Are there any good books that explore the psychology of the short-sightedness of most revolts? I don't know about that. I can say that there are, works out there that discuss revolts that took place and where they went off track, and what didn't work and maybe what would work in the future, and how these, wonderful ideals that people put forward are often co-opted or break down. So that could, that's a possibility, but you'd have to dig around for those. Okay. Yasinus XD, what's the best introductory book on symbolic logic? I don't know. I mean, we used Copy. I'm perfectly fine with Copy. There's other ones out there. They all more or less cover the same thing. Some of them have a few little twists and turns that they add to it. But, it's more or less the same stuff. August, I know you're covering Hegel's phenomenology of spirit. What do you think of it compared to the science of logic? I think the phenomenology is easier than the science of logic, which I find to be Hegel's toughest work. And distinguish the science of logic from the encyclopedia logic. The encyclopedia logic is much easier. So yeah, that's probably good enough. Chip, do you think it's important for a society to have a particular canon of literature and art that all educated people study as part of their education? I think it's important to have a wide canon that people select from. I mean, I can't think of any society ever that had a canon that all educated people within that society ever studied. And then there's studying, and then there's like passing tests on, right? Or I think a lot of the sort of like looking back to the good old days, people in the good old days often just sort of got through the curriculum. I don't think many of them actually understood it particularly well. But yeah, I think it's useful to have some sort of canon. But I don't think we have to be slaves to it. So yeah, there's my view. Vadrim, how would you describe the current state of current Western culture? It's a mess, terrible mess, and there's more than enough blame to throw around that no one particular group should be accorded all of it. Who should be so lucky as to get all the blame, right? And we just, we keep plowing away and keep muddling through. I think that, I think where we're going to be down the line is someday we're not going to speak of just Western culture, or when we do, we'll speak of it as sort of like, Western European / American, and then we'll contrast it or compare it with the other things that we've brought in as amalgams, like Chinese culture, Indian culture. And we'll look at it as, we look at Western culture somewhat anachronistically as being, Athens and Jerusalem, or Athens, Jerusalem, Rome. we're probably going to look at whatever culture survives us as Western culture, which is a mix of different things, along with lots of other things as well. And I view that as a good thing, because I'm interested in where humanity is going. I don't particularly care just for the West. Philosopher Ed, how did you and your wife get connected again after so many years? So yeah, I think a lot of people don't know this story. My wife and I met each other back in high school. I was a year ahead of her, and then we interacted for a while there. But she was, we could have dated, but it would probably, given our family situations, that would have been a terrible mess. But we were involved with other people and things like that. And then we ran across each other just about 4 blocks from here. In Milwaukee in the 1990s. We worked in the same massive office building. I was working as a third shift security guard. She was working in a bank, and we would cross paths and flirt with each other, not knowing that we were the same people. And then much later on, we reconnected through social media, through Facebook, through a mutual friend at that time of ours, who was at one time my arch rival, but who I'd become friends with. And then we began writing to each other and fell in love with each other through, you could say, a purely epistolary relationship before we started speaking on the phone, and then finally met face to face for the first time that would have been 1995 to 2000 something. Quite a while. And then we did the long distance thing for a while, and then I moved up to New York. And so someday we may actually write this down and make a good screenplay. I don't know if that'll happen. So moving on, Jinkleberry Tutu Petunia Muffin, quite a name. Dr. Sadler, is free will an illusion? Maybe yours is, mine isn't. No, free will is not an illusion. It's probably not what people make it out to be, like this total freedom of indifference or something like that. And there are many things that condition us, but we do have some freedom. All right, we're a little bit over time. I'm going to take as many questions as I can. Spedex, what do you think about supernaturalism, occultism, witchcraft, etc.? Does it exist? And also about secret sects, Illuminati, Satanism, Masonry, and how they're described in philosophy, and you're against it. Well, I think these are not all the same thing. Supernaturalism can mean multiple things, but one thing it can mean is there is something beyond just the realm of observable nature, and that doesn't necessarily tie you in with occultism or witchcraft or anything like that. As a matter of fact, a good portion of the history of philosophy would be supernatural in that sense, right? You could think of Plato's forms as being a form of supernaturalism. Secret sects, there, again, you got to look at it on a case-by-case basis. I think that there have been plenty of secret societies, some of them, quite powerful, some of them quite pathetic, and everything in between. How they're described in philosophy. Philosophy doesn't spend a lot of time describing that sort of stuff. So I think there's plenty of popular culture stuff and literature that does, but there's not a hell of a lot of discussion of that in philosophy. All right. Kostas, do you think Hegel was against intuition? And if not, how do you think he actually incorporated this notion into his philosophical system? Again, we're dealing with a lot of equivocal and ambiguous words. Intuition means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. If you mean sort of gut reaction or something like that, that's something you'd place at the level of Gefühl, feeling. And it's sort of the poorest type of knowledge that we have, purely subjective. Every once in a while somebody will be right, but they can also be right by using their brains, using the intellect, going beyond just mere gut impulses or something like that. Tai Saru, please explain Hegel's preface against prefaces. Hegel's commenting on the fact that, if you're doing some sort of systematic work, it's difficult to summarize it, which is what you're supposed to do in a preface, you know. And a lot of people back at that time and at this time just read the introductions and then skim over the body and read the conclusion of works. And Hegel is commenting on how that's not a very good approach to dialectical philosophy. And then he's providing you with a lot of the tools that he's going to use and ideas in the work. So I don't think that's very, I mean, read any sort of introduction to Hegel, and they'll tell you about that, right? All right, I'm going to skip over some of these other Hegel things and the virtue ethics joke. Made of Clay, have you read any John D. Caputo? How do you feel about him? Caputo's a good second-rate philosopher. He's a commentator on Derrida and other people. I don't find him particularly interesting, and I've actually been at conferences where he's presenting, and he's got his shtick, and you know what it is, and I've met many of his students, and they all have their same kind of shtick, and they can do what they want to do. It doesn't concern me much. I've already answered the question that Deutschrap asked. Do you have a political standpoint, or do you engage in politics some way? A little bit earlier. Out of step Nate reminds me, I do have a video dedicated to Leibniz and whether he's in Descartes' shadow. Yeah, I forgot about that. That was from when I was first shooting stuff, and I was still at Fayetteville State University. I'd shoot in the classroom, and I did these Dr. Sadler chalk and talk lectures. And the chalk and talk thing was to kind of stick it to the educational experts who are always saying, oh, you can't do chalk and talk, can't do lecture anymore, which is a sort of very faddish notion in curriculum design. In the mid-2000s onward, there's still people saying that sort of nonsense today, that the lecture is dead. A good example, again, by the way, right? Virtue ethics is coming back. Metaphysics is coming back. They never disappeared. The lecture is coming back. It never disappeared. It's always a question of whether people are doing it well or doing it poorly, and just, spending some time to figure out where people are doing that. Disciple of Ra, are Hegel's writings on Christianity worth delving into? What was Hegel's conception of God? How does his interpretation differ from Orthodox theology? So you mean like the early Hegel stuff, right? When he was still working with Schelling? Yeah, it's worth reading. There's an entire section of the phenomenology that's entitled Religion. So, and Hegel actually had a set of lectures that he did several times, lectures on the philosophy of religion. So are they worth delving into? Definitely. Yeah. I mean, it depends on, do you want to know what Hegel's views were on these things? Yes. They're very important. Hegel thinks that religion is sort of like philosophy, almost philosophy, for the less developed people. It's in the realm of Vorstellung, or representation, as opposed to conceptual thinking, Begriff. But it's an important part of our development. And you can't really understand history without understanding religions, not buying into them, but understanding them. And so Hegel thought of, his view is that God is actually ultimately the human community. So you could see that, Feuerbach is in some respects being the more faithful reinterpreter of Hegel when it comes to religion, and endorsing a kind of humanism. Have I ever read Peter W. Zapf? I don't even know that person's name, so no. Or if I have, maybe wrote in some anthology that I read years and years ago, but that I don't know. Charlie McDennis, what does Kierkegaard mean when he says by virtue of the absurd? He mentions it frequently in Fear and Trembling, and I've never got the concept of it. So Abraham acts by virtue of the absurd. That is, he engages himself in what he's doing, in the sort of, you might say, inability to explain it to other people in a rational way, and the anxiety that provokes. But the absurd means that there's like a whole set of open possibilities as well. So that's probably the best way to look at it. I mean, you could read Lev Shestov's Kierkegaard and the Existential Philosophy, which is a great discussion by somebody who thought Kierkegaard didn't go far enough with the absurd. And, you would get both Kierkegaard's notion and Shestov's notion there. Bogdan, are there any Marxist intellectuals you find interesting? And if so, who are they, not including Marx and Engels? Yeah, I mean, there's like a whole history of Marxist back and forth debate about, how should Marx's ideas be implemented. I mentioned earlier, talking about the critical theory and the Frankfurt School. Those guys are Marxists. I think they're interesting. I have friends who are Marxists, and we engage with discussing these matters. I'm not a Marxist myself, but I'm not an anti-Marxist either. I think Marx has a lot of interesting points to make, and that the focus on economic basis is important, and it's play and ideology. And I think there are classes. They're more complicated than Marx described because we're living in a different time. But yeah. All right. Can 7, do I have videos on analytic philosophy? Not at this time. I may down the line, depending on, if I find the time and if people commission me to do them. The one thing that I would probably do is eventually I'm going to start putting together curricula that I wanted to do for a while on the Indian Civil Service exam, helping people prepare for that. And their History of Philosophy segment has some analytic philosophy in it. So, there's that. Let me scroll down a bit. Thomas, what is a gap year? A year that you take off and you do something instead of study, like I did, where I worked first in a gas station and convenience store, then came down here, worked in a mortgage company for 3 weeks till they folded, and then got the security job, saved up some money, studied my languages, read, exercised. And if I hadn't done that, I could not have gone to graduate school because I was so burnt out on school by that time. Tyser, what is the distinction between the left Hegelians and right Hegelians? So the right Hegelians were more conservative, and they thought that essentially what we need to do is just make the reality that we live in more rational, but that Hegel had essentially laid out the blueprint for that. The left Hegelians thought that the Hegelian sort of, let's call it, techniques and tools were not fully exploited, and we needed to do more. So they were the ones, wanting to carry out some sort of revolution. Al-Zurani, what do you think of those who say that Hegel and Marxism is just a rebranded Lutheranism? I think that's completely wrong. And I don't know why anyone who actually understands Hegel or Marx or Lutheran theology would say anything like that. Yeah. Vadram, Andy O'Leary, are you familiar with Noam Chomsky's thought? What are your thoughts on them? I've mentioned this many times. As a linguist, I was very interested in philosophy of language. So as a linguist, Chomsky's interesting. I don't think he's right about, these basic structures. And, he's an interest when it comes to politics. He's a very consistent leftist thinker. So he's worth having in the conversation, and you got to admire consistency, right? So let's see here. I'm not sure how to read the Cyrillic things here, so I'm just going to say maybe Sawa. I've never heard you say anything on C.S. Peirce. Maybe I'm mistaken. Yeah, I've talked about him here and there before. Where I went to graduate school was a pluralistic department, analytic, continental, and classical American philosophy. So of course I read a lot of Peirce, James Dewey, and I read some Royce and Emerson and people like that as well. And Peirce is important for semiotics, right? Again, we started out this thing by talking about Umberto Eco. Peirce is one of the great triadic semioticians, along with people like, Jacobson and Helmslev and people like that. And then you've got the, semiology coming from de Saussure. When you guys hear about, post-structuralism, talking about the de Saussure and onward sort of ideas. But yeah, I mean, Peirce is okay. He's interesting. It's worth reading. August, if we're Americans and beginners in philosophy, we have to stay with English translations and English works. Do you know any non-English contemporary philosophers that might not be translated? Well, contemporary. You mean like people who are alive today? I don't know. I'm sure there's lots and lots of stuff, but I don't spend a lot of time reading contemporary philosophy anyway. I'd say there's lots of 20th century French and German and Italian and Spanish, language philosophy that has not been translated. It's part of why I did the translation that I did. And yeah, well, you have to stay with English translations and English works until you learn some foreign languages. Do that, and a world opens up for you, right? So, all right. Gustavo, what would be your suggestion to a guy starting his philosophy journey and is reading Aristotle but wants to jump to a modern philosopher but feels overwhelmed by possible required reading to get it? Well, start with Descartes and Hobbes then. There's not a hell of a lot of required reading in order to get into them, is there? I don't think so. You're certainly going to find reading Descartes helpful for reading Spinoza or Leibniz. And if you feel like jumping from Aristotle all the way into the modern age, then go ahead and do it. I mean, part of the philosophical journey is like making mistakes in your reading stuff, and being like, holy crap, I can't do this. I guess I'll have to backtrack. And you find out what works for you in that respect. And the first time you read stuff, you're not going to get even like 30% of what's in it anyway. You're going to have to keep rereading and rereading. And you can always go back to the ancients. I mean, I'd have to like chart out who I read first at what time, but I'm sure it's just a mess if I look at it. And, decades later, I can say that there's some parts of the history of philosophy that I know quite well. It's just sort of a gradual process. I would say my suggestion to a guy starting his philosophy journey is don't expect too much of yourself at any given point, right? Don't be too hard on yourself that you have to like totally understand Aristotle. Hell, I don't totally understand Aristotle. There's Aristotelian texts that I haven't read for years and years and years. And that's okay. There's others that I'm an expert on. And that's how it works. Bob Johnson, what is the best path for living the best possible life? Well, figure out what your actual values and priorities are, then figure out whether you've got those right, then start implementing those. All right. Kostas, I think Aristotle is more hard to understand because of the ambiguity of the notions he presents, and modern philosophers, they tend to be more precise. Depends on what modern philosophy you're talking about. Sometimes the precision is misleading too. All right. Oh, there's still a lot of questions, and we're getting close to we're 20 minutes over now. Okay. Bijan, what are my views on neo-Hegelian analytic philosophy, people like Brandom and McDowell? I haven't read McDowell. I've read Brandom, and Brandom is so he is an analytic philosopher, but the more that he does, where he's like delving effectively into non-analytic philosophers, the less like an analytic philosopher he is, and the more like a historian of philosophy he is. So he's got his origin in analytic philosophy, but I would say that a lot of Brandom's stuff isn't really analytic philosophy anymore. And that's a good thing, quite frankly. Somebody wrote, that would be awesome for a series on Thomas Reid. Well, yeah, the common sense philosophy. He's an interesting guy, but I don't teach him very often. And I mean, just when I teach like modern philosophy, when's the last time I taught that? It's years. So yeah. All right. Idabak, have you ever taken psychedelics? I think it's a fantastic tool for a philosopher, psychedelic influence on philosophy. There's almost no psychedelic influence on philosophy. There's plenty of like conspiracy theories out there, but they're based on so much. Could be, possibly, maybe this refers to this, and they're usually all just fine spun bullshit. Have I ever taken psychedelics? It depends on what you count as that. I once got a dose of PCP that I wasn't intending to get and never would have. And I tried ecstasy once, but neither of them are really psychedelics. I don't do acid or mushrooms or things like that. I think a lot of the notion of opening up, doors, it would really depend on the preparation of the person. And drugs are a crutch. I mean, the things that you can accomplish with them, you can probably also accomplish in other ways, through visualization and meditation. And most of the people that I know that are really into psychedelics are dummies and duds. And you listen to them, it's the same shtick over and over and over again. There's a few brilliant people I've met who are into that, but not many of them. So I think for a lot of people, they would not be helpful at all. I mean, could they be of some use? Sure. Sort of the way that antidepressants can be of some use, but then you got to work on yourself once you've got that crutch in place to produce any lasting effects. And I think that the notion of shortcuts, there are no shortcuts in philosophy, period. You put in the work or you don't, all right. Let's see. AP, have you read Montaigne? Yeah, I like Montaigne. He's an interesting guy. Here's a funny question from Fabio. Why is Hegel hard to read? Well, because he's dealing with very complicated and intertangled concepts, for one thing. And he's also not a great writer, for another thing, right? He's hard to read in the English and he's hard to read in the German. And sometimes he takes terms and makes them his own and does new things with them. So those are all reasons why Hegel is hard to read. All right. Let's see here. So Francis asks, what did Kant mean by the synthetic unity of apperception in the first critique? And then somebody writes, there's like a million resources on that. It's quite true. So I mean, the synthetic unity of apperception, we're perceiving things and we don't perceive them just as a bunch of like little bits of data. Sort of like, think about you seeing my face. You're not just seeing a bunch of pixels. There is some sort of synthesizing process that puts things together. And there are many, many resources on that. What's my favorite quote from Z-Sound? I don't know. I don't have favorites when it comes to most things anymore. What did Aristotle? Here's from We Keeps It Real Boxing. What did Aristotle mean when he said a happy person could never become miserable? That's a quote totally taken out of context. It's from if I remember right, probably Nicomachean Ethics Book 1, and he's discussing conditions, but happy people can in fact become unhappy, if not necessarily miserable, for Aristotle, because happiness depends on a couple different factors. All right. Stataton Maniton. Do you consider yourself a philosopher or someone who teaches philosophy? Both. I don't necessarily consider myself a first-rate philosopher. But, I'm definitely a philosopher. I actually describe myself when people are like, well, what do you do? I say I'm a philosopher in private practice. Although this semester, teaching an awful lot. So I'm almost, I'm more than full-time academic if you look at the different places I've spread my classes out over. But yeah, I'm a philosopher. Anonymous, why are people trying to control the social discussion? For a while now, the Democrat and Republican Party has become more extreme. Why do you think this is happening? Is it because people are fractioning lives into smaller groups? So that's a big question, and there's a lot of research out there on this sort of stuff. But I think, a good bit of it is the sort of unwillingness to engage with other people. And I think social media has made this worse because you can have echo chambers where everybody's, essentially blowing smoke up your butt, telling you how great you are and how terrible those other people are, and it's all their fault. That didn't help. And I think there's very few people who, despite their lip service to a common good or something like that, who actually do care about a common good. Or give any thought to what that might look like, which would include a society in which we can actually have genuine civil disagreement with each other. All right. Let's see. We're at 11:30 or 1:30. Let me take just one more. I'm not going to get to everybody, but that's usually the case. So for sure, I've been reading Locke chapter 5 in the second treatise. It seems that the introduction of money renders his measure of property and the three provisos unaccounted for. Is that correct? Renders his measure of property. When you're saying measure of property, you mean like legitimate amount to have, and the three provisos that there's enough left for other people, that sort of thing. Yeah, I mean, actually, Locke talks about the use of money as involving tacit and voluntary consent to a new arrangement of things, and money allows, say, labor to be bought, right? And it allows new ways of organizing land and the economy and property to occur. So is the introduction of money rendering these unaccounted for? I don't know what unaccounted for means in this case, but it certainly does transform things. So, all right, we're now quite late. Usually I plan about an hour for this. I've got to get to grading and a number of other activities before I meet with my Patreon supporters for the philosophy chat later on today. So thanks for all of your questions and comments. And yeah, there's quite a few, like I said, I didn't get to, but not too many, at least this time around. So that's good. All right. I hope all of you have a great weekend, and maybe I'll see you in another one of these online events.